Calico was a 19-year-old University of New Mexico student who disappeared on September 20th, 1988 while riding her bike near her home in Belen, New Mexico. She never returned, and no physical evidence of her fate was ever found. 3 months after she went missing, a Polaroid was discovered in a Florida parking lot, showing a young woman and a boy bound and gagged inside a van. Tara's family believed the woman closely resembled her, noting similar facial features and a scar consistent with Tara's medical history. But the photo was never definitively identified or traced to its source. Tara Calico was never found, the boy in the photo was never identified, and no arrests were ever made. In 2023, Delbert Cornish shot and killed his 18-year-old daughter, Hope Onyx Cornish, inside their home in Caldwell, Idaho. After killing her, he also shot and killed her pet cat. Cornish later admitted to the killings, telling police, "My kids died by my hand." At the time of her death, Hope had reportedly been turning her life around. Family members said she'd been sober for more than a year, was working, and had recently started building more stability in her life. But despite this, Cornish told investigators he killed her and her cat because he was, quote, tired of them being made fun of. Authorities found no evidence of provocation or self-defense and said the killing was deliberate. Cornish later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Eminem was stalked by the same man who broke into his properties 3 times over 6 years, repeatedly reaching him despite arrests and court orders. In 2019, the stalker broke into one of Eminem's former homes and told the new homeowner he was looking for his brother Marshall. In 2020, he escalated by entering Eminem's actual residence through an unlocked entry point while Eminem was asleep, later telling police he was there to kill him. After being arrested and convicted, the man returned again in 2024, once more breaching Eminem's property. Court records show the break-ins weren't the result of sophisticated planning, but repeated exploitation of access points and timing, highlighting how even high-level security measures can fail against persistent obsession. Eminem was unharmed, but prosecutors described the pattern as escalating and dangerous. A mummified carrier pigeon found inside a UK chimney in 1982 was carrying an encrypted World War II message from 1944 that's never been decoded. The pigeon likely died mid-mission during Britain's wartime communications and remained sealed in the chimney for nearly 40 years. Attached to its leg was a capsule holding a coded strip of letters and numbers believed to be connected to D-Day operations. Despite repeated attempts by historians and codebreakers, the message's meaning and destination remain unknown. Britain's intelligence agency GCHQ has confirmed the cipher is still unsolved and publicly asked for help deciphering it, leaving whatever information the pigeon was carrying permanently undelivered.
I got my cat down.
It doesn't get easier to watch. Oh, that's a tough watch. That was when Twitch streamer Biscuit suffered a sudden severe injury live on stream after her katana slipped from its sheath. As the blade fell toward the floor, she instinctively tried to grab it, and it sliced into her hand, severing 2 tendons. She ended the stream almost immediately as she was taken to the emergency room.
I need to cut stream. I have to go to ER. I think I f***ed my fingers.
Hours later, the streamer posted an update from the hospital showing her arm heavily bandaged and immobilized. Tendon damage often requires surgery and long rehabilitation, with no guarantee of full strength or mobility ever returning. Juan Fernando Hermosa is considered the youngest serial killer in Ecuadorian history. Between 1991 and 1992, Hermosa murdered at least 22 people when he was just 15 years old, targeting taxi drivers and stealing their vehicles. But because he was a minor at the time of the killing, Ecuadorian law capped his sentence at 4 years regardless of the number of victims, and Hermosa was released after serving the maximum juvenile sentence. Almost immediately after his release, he was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered as an act of vigilante revenge connected to his heinous crimes. 2024, Detroit man Curtis Dixon helped a man he believed was blind and even tried to give him money despite being broke. The encounter was secretly filmed as part of a social media video by Zachary Dereniowski, whose content involves pretending to be vulnerable to test strangers' kindness. Curtis was given $1,000 and the video went viral, portraying him as exceptionally compassionate, and he was given $100,000 more in a follow-up video. But within a few weeks of the videos gaining traction, Dixon was targeted because of the attention and cash he had received. He was lured outside under the pretense of helping a woman with her broken-down car, ambushed, kidnapped, beaten, and forced to withdraw money out of ATMs. His attackers then tied him up, poured gasoline on his SUV, and set it on fire. Luckily, Dixon survived after being pulled to safety, and multiple suspects were arrested, including his own nephew, turning the case into a chilling example of how kindness can turn someone into a target and transform a good deed into a near-fatal outcome. 1993, Sicilian Mafia boss Giovanni Brusca ordered the kidnapping of 12-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo to silence his father, a former mob insider who had begun cooperating with authorities. Disguised as police, captors lured the boy away, promising to reunite him with his dad. He was held for 779 days in degrading conditions, often caged, beaten, underfed, and moved between hideouts, while photos of his suffering were sent to pressure his father into silence. When testimony continued, Brusca ordered the kill, dismissing the boy as the puppy. Giuseppe was strangled and his body dissolved in acid to erase all evidence. The murder shocked Italy because it shattered the long-promoted myth that the Mafia followed a code of honor that spared all children. But investigators in later trials revealed that this was never truly a rule, and Giuseppe's death became one of the most disturbing symbols of the Mafia's retaliation tactics during the 1990s crackdowns. In 2019, police uncovered an abuse case at the Danby House nursing home in North Carolina after staff were caught recording and encouraging violent confrontations between elderly residents with dementia. Investigators said workers laughed, filmed, and allegedly urged a 73-year-old man to attack a 70-year-old woman, shouting instructions like punch her in the face while she cried for help. Both residents required constant care and couldn't fully understand what was happening, turning a supervised environment into exploitation for entertainment. The footage led to criminal charges and renewed scrutiny over how vulnerable patients in long-term care facilities can be manipulated by caregivers. That was when 25-year-old Erica Mae Butts was hyperventilating in court after receiving a life sentence for the death of 3-year-old Serenity Richardson in 2011. Prosecutors said the girl was repeatedly abused inside a South Carolina home, including being struck with a belt several times after wetting herself. When she was finally taken to the hospital, doctors documented extreme bruising and severe injuries across her body, and she later died from the trauma. Serenity had been left in Erica's care while her mother was trying to relocate. Another woman living in the home, Shanita Latrice Cunningham, was also charged in the case. Both women entered guilty pleas to homicide by child abuse and were sentenced to life in prison. They responded by collapsing in the courtroom, making a scene and crying hysterically before being dragged out. In 2006, comedian Bill Maher sparked backlash after attending a Halloween party dressed as Steve Irwin, wearing a khaki outfit with a fake stingray barbed through his chest just weeks after Irwin's real-life death. Irwin had died that September while filming a documentary when a stingray's barb pierced his heart, making the costume feel especially raw to fans and the public. Maher later defended it as dark humor, arguing that risk comes with working around wild animals, but critics called it disrespectful and too soon, turning the outfit into one of the most controversial celebrity costumes of the era. A 49-year-old man in Romania caused a devastating accident in 2016 while cutting firewood with a neighbor after the two had reportedly been drinking together. Authorities said he mishandled a running chainsaw during what witnesses described as joking around, striking the 53-year-old victim directly in the groin. The man was rushed into emergency surgery with catastrophic injuries, but doctors were unable to save his floppy Johnson. Investigators treated the incident as a reckless accident rather than an intentional attack, a grim reminder of how alcohol and dangerous objects can quickly turn a fun night into a life-altering tragedy. Of all time, South African trophy hunter Marilies van der Merwe drew backlash after killing a 17-year-old bull giraffe during a Valentine's Day hunt her husband reportedly paid for. After shooting the animal, she cut out its heart and presented it to her husband as a Valentine's Day gift, later posting photos with it online. The images quickly went viral and sparked criticism worldwide, but she defended the hunt by saying regulated trophy hunts generate permit fees that go toward wildlife management, anti-poaching efforts, and local land conservation, and that older, non-breeding animals are often selected to reduce pressure on habitats. In 2020, a Dollar General employee with diabetes was fired after drinking a $2 orange juice at the register when she began feeling symptoms of diabetic shock. The company said she violated policy by consuming merchandise before paying for it, labeling the act as grazing even though she later paid for the drink. The dispute escalated into a lawsuit, and a jury ultimately awarded her $277,000 in damages, turning the incident into a widely discussed example of strict workplace policy clashing with a medical emergency. A college party clip blew up online after looks-maxing streamer Clavicular got brutally frame-mogged by an ASU frat lord standing beside him with zero effort, the camera angle draining his aura in real time. The posture diff locked him into a ruthless side-by-side that spread across feeds like wildfire. The moment triggered instant cortisol spikes and total aura collapse, while the frat leader named Varys leaned into the attention, jester maxing across campus and dropping the nonchalant gimmick that made the clip go viral. Themes across the internet quickly flooded the timeline, going full goon max over every micro-expression like it was a historical artifact, reposting the same frozen frame until it became the only canon version people recognized. Edits kept looping, glaze levels stayed high, and the posture diff turned into permanent lore. What should have been a forgettable party interaction became a snapshot the algorithm refused to let die, slowly reshaping Clavicular's image into a meme defined by one cursed angle. 4-year-old Bulgarian influencer Andrea Ivanova drew global attention after reportedly spending more than $49,000 on repeated lip filler procedures in pursuit of extreme cosmetic changes. She's publicly shared complications following treatments, including severe swelling, discomfort, and being unable to fully close her mouth. Doctors warn that excessive filler can stretch tissue, increase infection risk, and permanently alter normal facial function. In 2018, a 34-year-old man in Hunan, China attempted to fake his own death by sending his car into a river as part of an insurance fraud scheme meant to send his family a payout of about $145,000. But fully believing her husband had truly died, his wife later drowned their 2 children before taking her own life. Authorities said she had no knowledge of the plan and had been under severe emotional and financial stress, including heavy medical expenses tied to a child's epilepsy treatment. The man resurfaced days later and turned himself into police, telling investigators the scheme was driven by debt, turning what began as a fraud attempt into a fatal chain of unintended consequences. 3-year-old Arizona man Christopher Todd Eric died following a mental health crisis and was mistakenly recorded as unclaimed due to a clerical error, according to his family's allegations. Years later, his mother said she recognized his preserved body inside a public anatomical exhibit, where it had been plastinated and displayed without her knowledge or consent. She's since pursued legal action seeking to recover his remains and challenge how unclaimed bodies are processed, sparking debate over consent, medical displays, and the ethical handling of human remains. A Connecticut man survived a horrific workplace accident after his arm became trapped inside an industrial furnace for 3 days. As circulation failed and tissue began to decay, he reportedly tried to amputate his own arm using a saw blade after noticing the smell of rotting flesh, but he lost consciousness from pain before he was able to finish. Concerned when he failed to show up for work, a friend contacted authorities, and rescuers eventually freed him, preventing a more than likely fatal outcome. December of 1988, Hollywood cameraman Bob Samuels, whose credits included Short Circuit, The Color Purple, and Beverly Hills Cop 2, was found shot to death in his Northridge home, killed through a pillow used as a crude silencer. Investigators later accused his estranged wife, Mary Ellen Samuels, of arranging the murder to collect a $500,000 life insurance payout. Afterwards, she was said to have spent lavishly, including a Cancun trip where photos surfaced of her posing nude with large amounts of cash. Prosecutors also alleged that when the hired gunman began cooperating with authorities, she arranged for him to be strangled before he could testify. She was ultimately convicted for her role in the conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. In August of 1993, 6 Kazakhstani hikers died during a trek through Siberia's Kamar Daban mountain range. The only survivor later told investigators that members of the group suddenly began screaming, bleeding from their eyes and ears, foaming at the mouth, and clawing at their throats before collapsing one by one on the mountainside. Official reports ultimately ruled most of the deaths as hypothermia, with the group leader reportedly dying from a heart attack. But the survivor's description of the final moments has kept the incident controversial, with theories ranging from altitude sickness and poisoning to extreme weather exposure. Star Johnny Gaudreau, known as Johnny Hockey, built a reputation as one of the league's most electric undersized scorers, dazzling fans with elite speed despite standing just 5'9". But in August of 2024, he returned to his New Jersey hometown with his younger brother Matthew for their sister's wedding weekend, a trip meant to be a celebration. While riding bicycles together along a rural road at night, police say a drunk driver attempted to pass traffic and slammed into both brothers from behind, killing them at the young ages of 31 and 29. Prosecutors later charged the driver with aggravated manslaughter, reckless vehicular homicide, evidence tampering, and leaving the scene, with the case still moving through courts as the hockey world mourned one of its brightest stars. But just today, after Team USA defeated Canada in overtime to secure Olympic gold, players carried Gaudreau's number 13 jersey onto the ice and brought his children into the celebration, dedicating the victory to him in an emotional tribute that showed how deeply his loss still resonates across the sport. A high school principal, Dr. George Kenny, built a devoted following by hypnotizing students to boost confidence and performance despite not being licensed. But in 2011, 3 teens he had worked with died within months of each other, 1 in a car crash and 2 by suicide, raising alarm from families who believed the hypnosis may have caused psychological harm. Investigators never proved a direct link to the deaths, but Kenny was charged with practicing hypnosis without a license, pleaded no contest, and resigned in 2012. Lawsuits from the victims' families ended in settlements, while Kenny quietly left Florida and withdrew from public life, leaving the controversy unresolved. John C. Woods, the U.S. Army hangman who carried out the executions of Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, completely lied about his qualifications to get the job, claiming prior experience as an executioner when none of it could later be verified. As a result of his incompetence, several condemned Nazi officials did not die from a clean neck break, which is the intended outcome of a properly calculated drop. Instead, multiple prisoners slowly strangled in agony, some taking up to 20 minutes to die while witnesses observed visible suffering. Despite complaints from observers, Woods continued performing executions and was never formally disciplined for the botched hangings. Toru Kobayashi, the competitive eater who helped popularize modern eating contests, said he stepped away from competition after years of extreme training left him disconnected from normal hunger. In recent interviews, he's explained that he rarely feels hunger and sometimes even forgets to eat, saying he envies people whose bodies still send basic appetite signals. Kobayashi suggested that constantly forcing himself beyond fullness may have dulled the body's natural warning system, with doctors noting that long-term competitive eating can distort hunger cues and place lasting stress on the body's digestive system. In December of 1984, 12-year-old Janelle Matthews disappeared from her home in Greeley, Colorado, after returning from a school concert, leaving behind signs that she'd been taken from the house. For decades, the case went unsolved until construction workers discovered her remains in 2019, 15 miles away from where she disappeared. Investigators soon focused on former neighbor Stephen Pankey, who'd repeatedly inserted himself into public discussions about the case and referenced it several times while running for governor of Idaho. Prosecutors said his own statements and changing stories helped tie him to the crime. In 2022, Pankey was convicted of kidnapping and murder and later sentenced to life in prison. Facts I've ever posted about 9/11. In 1983, professional climber Dan Goodwin illegally climbed the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He said he was trying to bring attention to the inability to rescue trapped occupants of the upper levels of skyscrapers. In August of 2001, actor James Woods reported 4 suspicious men on his flight, but authorities didn't take his claims seriously. Turns out there were 4 of the hijackers who would go on to crash into the World Trade Center, and this was one of their test runs. Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shamu Sood warned about a major terrorist attack that was about to happen on U.S. soil, but he ended up being assassinated just 2 days before 9/11. An FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill urged the federal government to take the threat of Al-Qaeda more seriously, but he was eventually pushed into early retirement due to disagreements with the Bureau. He went on to head security at the World Trade Center, where he was killed on 9/11. Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg were both booked to fly on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. But Wahlberg decided last minute to fly to Toronto instead, while MacFarlane missed the flight by 10 minutes due to a hangover. Released in June of 2000, video game Deus Ex didn't include the World Trade Center in its skyline due to technical limitations. The in-game explanation explanation was that they were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In August of 2000, the band Dream Theater recorded a live studio album called Live Scenes from New York. The album cover art features the New York City skyline with the Twin Towers on fire. Most disturbingly, the album was quickly pulled from shelves after coincidentally being released on September 11, 2001. Only one non-military plane was allowed to fly after all commercial flights were forced to land. It was delivering anti-venom to a snake handler in Florida who was bitten by the highly venomous taipan snake. Sculptor Michael Richards was killed in his art studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower on 9/11. His art ironically focused on planes, including a sculpture of airplanes piercing a cast of his own body. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. The only off-duty NYPD officer who was killed in 9/11 had signed his retirement papers that morning, but instead of leaving his badge, John William Perry decided to pick it up one last time. Here's a photo of Pork Chop the search dog receiving fluids and comfort before returning to his duties. Many 9/11 rescue dogs were becoming depressed because they weren't finding any live bodies. Rescue workers had to constantly bury themselves to trick the dogs into thinking they were actually saving someone. Tanya Head was a well-known 9/11 survivor who faked being in the South Tower during the attacks. She served as president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network for years until it was revealed she wasn't even in the country on 9/11. Known as the Meteor, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the towers collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being recovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the roof of a nearby bank. And as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on top of a Manhattan rooftop more than a decade after the attacks. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up only damaging one office room, and he was the only person that died. Since 9/11, more than 40,000 people have been diagnosed with cancers and chronic illnesses linked to the toxic dust released when the towers collapsed, a debris cloud made up of pulverized concrete, asbestos, fuel, and materials from office equipment and lighting systems. More first responders have died from 9/11 related illnesses than on the actual day of 9/11. Even nearly 25 years after the attacks, victims of 9/11 are still being identified. In 2025, 3 more people were named through advanced DNA testing using tiny fragments recovered from the World Trade Center site. But of the 2,977 victims, 1,100 of them still have no identified remains. This is a photo of a captive orca whale named Tilikum staring down its trainers at SeaWorld. There have only been 4 human deaths caused by orcas to date, and Tilikum was responsible for 3 of them. In one instance in 2010, 40-year-old Don Brancho leaned over his tank during something known as a relationship session. That's when the 11-ton orca took her in his mouth, dragged her into the water, and violently killed her in front of hundreds of terrified tourists. Even when SeaWorld staff members had trapped and netted him, Tilikum refused to let go of the body. It's believed his hostility was caused by a total accident that happened just minutes prior to the attack. Tilikum performed a trick that Dawn didn't see, so she didn't reward him with fish as she normally would. This, coupled with the psychological damage of living in captivity, resulted in the orca's unnatural aggression. As part of a fundraising publicity stunt in 1986, United Way released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland, Ohio. But the event resulted in utter disaster since the balloons clogged various waterways and even shut down an airport. They also interrupted a Coast Guard search for 2 missing boaters who were later found to have drowned. As a sign of mourning, ancient Egyptians would often shave their eyebrows when their cats died. David Gaines earned 5 bachelor degrees at the same time at the University of Connecticut, but he sadly drowned and died just a few months after graduating because he never learned how to swim. If you ever have a kidney stone, just take a ride on Thunder Mountain in Disney World. After hearing rumors, a Michigan urologist took kidney models filled with stones on the ride. He found that the stones were passed up to 70% of the time depending on where he sat. Donda West was turned down by many plastic surgeons before she found one who would perform on her despite her heart condition. Sadly, as a result of the surgery, she died the next day, and Kanye has blamed himself ever since. The last French soldier to die in World War I was killed just 15 minutes before the ceasefire. He was trying to deliver a message to his unit that soup would be served for lunch. A man from Turkey locked his head in a cage for weeks in an attempt to quit smoking. His wife held on to the key and only opened it for meals and sleep. In 2014, General Motors recalled 2.5 million cars for faulty ignitions. The cars would literally shut off while being driven, so drivers would lose control of their brakes and airbags wouldn't deploy. GM knew about the problem since 2005, but never fixed it because it would be too expensive. And as a result, over 100 people died. An Indian actor named Shyam risked his life to transform for a role. He went 9 straight days without sleep so that the tissues under his eyes would swell up. These photos show what 4 years of fighting in World War II did to the face of a young Soviet man. As the museum caption reads, "The first face looks at you, the second face looks through you." In 2008, Chinese milk company Sanlu tainted their baby formula with melamine so that they could pass quality control. As a result, at least 6 infants died from kidney stones and hundreds of thousands more got sick. This photo shows main culprit Gang Jinping begging for forgiveness during his trial before he was executed by firing squad. It was such a massive scandal that Chinese people still refuse to buy baby formula domestically. 19-year-old Australian Sam Ballard was a star rugby player until he was dared to eat a garden slug at a team party. The slug ended up infecting him with a condition called rat lungworm, which paralyzed him and eventually killed him 8 years later. In 2014, it was reported that Kim Jong-un killed his own uncle by throwing him into a cage filled with hundreds of stray dogs. In Berlin, Germany, there's now a playground on top of the site where Hitler allegedly killed himself during World War II. Serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally killed in prison when another inmate beat him to death with a metal bar. The killer later revealed that he did it because he was sick of Jeffrey making the prison food look like severed limbs to tease the other inmates. Dutch passenger Cor Pan jokingly made this post just months after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 went missing. Little did he know his own flight would meet a similar fate, as MH17 was shot down over Ukraine, killing everyone on board. Hannibal of Carthage was famous for intimidating his Roman enemies through the use of war elephants. But the Romans eventually learned that elephants are afraid of squealing pigs, so they would lather pigs in tar and set them on fire, sending the enemy elephants fleeing in horror. This is where the term war pigs originated from. Playboy model Anna Nicole Smith didn't receive a single penny when her 90-year-old billionaire husband died. Oil tycoon J. Howard Marshall never included her in his will and left his $1.6 billion estate to his son. If you receive the wrong blood type for a transfusion, one of the symptoms is a sense of impending doom. In 1771, a Scottish woman was sentenced to death by hanging for the crime of hiding a pregnancy. Maggie Dixon was hung, declared dead, and carted off in a wooden coffin. She then suddenly woke up on the way to the graveyard and was later released since her sentence had been carried out. She lived for another 40 years, known as Half Hang It Maggie. A 42-year-old British woman received over $70,000 in donations after setting up a GoFundMe to fund her cancer treatment. But it turned out she was a total fraud and was instead using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The heaviest human ever recorded weighed 1,400 pounds at his peak. He once lost over 900 pounds, only to gain it all back later in life. In 2002, 2 airplanes collided over Germany, killing all 71 total passengers on board. 2 years later, the air traffic controller who was responsible was stabbed to death by a Russian man named Vitaly Kaloyev, whose wife and 2 kids were victims of the crash. Kaloyev was only sentenced to 2 years in prison and was hailed as a hero back in Russia. In 2019, a British teenager went blind after maintaining a horrendous diet for several years. It consisted of French fries, white bread, Pringles, and the occasional slice of ham. In 2013, Disney abandoned their policy of letting disabled people skip lines at their theme parks. This was because too many people were hiring disabled tour guides to help them skip the lines. These are photos of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko before and after he was poisoned by Vladimir Putin in 2004. He and his family believe the assassination attempt was ordered because Yushchenko wanted Ukraine to integrate more with the rest of Europe. A doctor chronicled the progression of Alzheimer's disease in one of his patients by collecting her signatures on medical forms over the years. Ever since the Taliban takeover, the price for a kidney on the Afghan black market has dropped from $4,000 to $1,500. This is because so many people have been selling their own kidneys just so they can afford to feed their children. Such high supply of the organ has caused the price to plummet in short time. In 1981, Japanese college student Issei Sagawa invited over his classmate Renee Hartfelt for dinner at his apartment. He told the 25-year-old Dutch student that he would help her translate some poetry for a school assignment, but his real plan was much darker. As Hartfelt was reading from a poem, Sagawa shot her in the back of the head and killed her instantly. He spent the next 2 days eating her flesh so that he could absorb her health and beauty, characteristics which he felt he lacked. It was a plan that was decades in the making, but it only took police 2 days to arrest him. But a French court deported him to Japan, where he avoided serving any jail time due to a legal technicality. He remains free to this day and even says he wants to taste human flesh again before he dies. In 2014, Charles Manson was granted a license to marry 26-year-old self-proclaimed superfan Afton Burton. But the wedding was called off once it was revealed that Burton only wanted to marry him so that she could use his corpse as a tourist attraction once he died. The German pharmaceutical company that produces aspirin once marketed heroin as a pain remedy for children. The four-penny coffin was one of the first homeless shelters created by the Salvation Army in the late 19th century. For 4 pennies, you could receive food and shelter and could sleep in a coffin-sized wooden box with a tarp. On the right is a photo of the former girlfriend of serial killer Ivan Milat posing on a beach. Unbeknownst to her, she was wearing a sweater that belonged to one of Ivan's victims, which he gave to her as a gift. In the famous first edition of Playboy, Hugh Hefner published nude photos of Marilyn Monroe without her permission. He later purchased the crypt beside her even though they'd never met in life, and now he's buried next to her. The Great Smog of London in 1952 was so bad that pedestrians couldn't even see their shoes. It resulted in the deaths of 4,000 people, many of whom fell into the Thames River and drowned simply because they couldn't see it. In 1998, Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left behind during a diving trip in the Great Barrier Reef. It took 2 days for anyone to even notice before an extensive search was launched. 6 months later, their closing gear washed up along with a dive slate that read, "Please rescue us before we die." Their ultimate cause of death remains unknown since their bodies were never recovered. Slovenian woman Julia Adlisic cut off her own hand with a table saw and purposely left it at home when she went to the hospital. She did this to receive $1.2 million in payout from the 5 insurance companies she signed up for. But instead of getting paid, she was sentenced to 2 years in jail for insurance fraud. Anyone who moves to Villas Las Estrellas in Antarctica must have their appendix preemptively removed because the nearest hospital is over 600 miles away. This is an image of a patient with claustrophobia who panicked during a CT scan. This little girl is the stepdaughter of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Directly under her bedroom was the crawl space where John stuffed the bodies of 26 of his victims, meaning she literally slept over a graveyard. Human injuries from stingrays are extremely rare and almost never fatal. When Steve Irwin was killed by one in 2006, he was only the second reported stingray fatality in Australia since 1945. It was a total freak accident that he only died from because the barb went directly into his heart. In 1921, spiritualists Thomas Bradford and Ruth Doran wanted to test whether it was possible to communicate with the dead. So naturally, Bradford killed himself via carbon monoxide poisoning and planned to appear in front of Doran as a ghost. He never did. In 2014, scientists found a giant 30,000-year-old virus in Russian permafrost. After thawing out, the virus was still infectious and even began killing amoebas. This raised concerns that melting or drilling into Arctic ice could unleash previously undiscovered pathogenic viruses. A Dutch teenager who was going bungee jumping in Spain died after a horrible misunderstanding. The instructor, who had poor English, said no jump, but she heard it as now jump and ended up jumping straight to her death. This is exactly why commands are never supposed to be given with a no or a don't. President JFK's convertible wasn't scrapped when he was assassinated in 1963. They just welded a roof on top and it was used by the next 4 presidents right up until 1977. In 2003, Kenneth Maxwell called 911 to report a house fire that he came across while driving home from work. But his voice suddenly cut off during the call, and when firemen arrived at the scene, Kenneth was found shot dead in his car. It turned out the fire was created to cover up a double homicide, and the killer saw Kenneth making the call. Morticians often use these spiky contacts to keep the eyes of the dead closed during funeral viewings. During World War II, one of the first Japanese cities that the US planned on nuking was its former capital, Kyoto. The only reason it wasn't bombed was because US Secretary of War Henry Stimson spent his honeymoon there and thought it was a nice place. So instead of Kyoto, they went with Nagasaki. Contrary to what was reported at the time, Ronald Reagan lost more than half his blood and came within seconds of dying when he was shot in 1981. His true condition was concealed from the public for nearly 30 years. In an average lifetime, human skin completely replaces itself more than 900 times. A Russian woman named Kristina Ozturk is addicted to having kids and vows to have over 100 by the time she turns 30. She's only 23 years old and already has 11 kids with her 56-year-old husband. In 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die in space. His craft had over 200 known flaws, but his attempts to delay the flight were rejected. Had he refused the mission, his friend Yuri Gagarin would have been sent instead. Vladimir specifically asked the authorities to give him an open casket funeral after the mission. Before he became famous, Vanilla Ice claims he survived a brutal stabbing and a near-fatal nightclub attack. When he was 16, he got caught in the middle of a gang fight in South Dallas and was stabbed 5 times, one wound narrowly missing his heart. Doctors reportedly said the blade came so close that another half-inch would have killed him. Months later, he was nearly beaten to death outside a club after a show, leaving him with permanent nerve damage in his arm. This doll belonging to a 5-year-old girl has been watching over her gravesite since her death in 1912. In April of 2001, 20-year-old Branson Perry completely vanished from his father's home in Skidmore, Missouri. He told a friend he was stepping outside to put a pair of jumper cables into the shed, but was never seen again. His van, wallet, and all personal belongings were left behind. Despite searches, interviews, and 2 decades of investigation, no remains have ever been found and no one has ever been charged. To this day, Branson Perry's disappearance remains one of Missouri's most haunting unsolved cases. In 2012, Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine nearly died from an undiagnosed ectopic pregnancy, which happens when a fertilized egg implants outside the uterus, usually in a fallopian tube, where it can't grow and can rupture suddenly, causing severe internal bleeding. She went on stage while bleeding internally, thinking it was normal pain, and later learned her fallopian tube had ruptured, leaving what doctors described as a Coke can's worth of blood inside her abdomen. She required emergency surgery to remove the tube and stop the internal bleeding. Florence later said it was the closest she's ever come to dying by far. In 2023, 16-year-old Bryce Brooks from Atlanta jumped into the ocean in Pensacola to save 4 younger kids he'd never met who were being pulled out by a strong rip current. He managed to help get them to safety, but the current dragged him under before he could escape. A family friend, 67-year-old Charles Johnson II, rushed in attempting to save Bryce but was also pulled under. The 4 children survived, but Bryce and Charles didn't make it, and both were later honored as heroes for sacrificing their lives to save others. Trailer Park Boys star Mike Smith, best known as the harmless wide-eyed Bubbles, has been charged with sexual assault in Nova Scotia for an incident that allegedly happened back in 2017, a case that stayed buried for nearly 8 years before finally surfacing in court. The identity of the victim is under a strict publication ban, but Smith is now legally barred from contacting them or going anywhere near their work, home, or school. The charge has forced him to step away from the Trailer Park Boys production company, tainting the wholesome persona millions have associated with him. Deep inside a sulfur-filled cave on the Albania-Greece border, scientists have uncovered the largest spiderweb ever recorded, an enormous 106-meter sheet stretched across the cavern's walls. Hundreds of thousands of spiders from 2 normally rival species have formed a massive cooperative colony, a terrifying behavior never before seen in spiders. The cave's toxic, sunless environment created a self-sustaining ecosystem powered by sulfur-eating microbes, which attracted swarms of insects, which in turn supplied this spider megacity with endless food. The web is so dense and vast, it looks like the cave is wrapped in ghostly white fabric, proof that life can evolve into something terrifyingly efficient when pushed into extreme conditions. In 2023, British TV presenter Holly Willoughby narrowly escaped a fate straight out of a nightmare. Her stalker, 36-year-old security guard Gavin Plump, had been secretly building what prosecutors called a murder kit in his Essex home. Ropes, metal cable ties, chloroform, and knives, all carefully organized for a late-night abduction. He spent over 18 months plotting every step, obsessively saving thousands of images of Willoughby, including hundreds of deepfakes he made to fuel his fantasies. Plum shared his entire plan with someone he met on a dark chat room called Abduct Lover, lovers, where over 100 members spent hours trading violent fantasies. He even sent voice memos describing how they'd hit at night when traffic was low, and how he'd chloroform both of them, referring to Willoughby and her husband. But what he didn't know was that his online partner wasn't a killer, he was an undercover US federal agent. When British police stormed Plum's apartment, they found his computer filled with explicit material, detailed kidnap instructions, and surveillance notes about Willoughby's security routines. He knew her full schedule and had even written down what time she usually woke up. In July of 2024, Plum was sentenced to life in prison with at least 16 years before parole. On November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the largest freighters to ever sail the Great Lakes, vanished without a single distress call. She was hauling 26,000 tons of iron ore across Lake Superior, a route sailors today still call the graveyard of the Great Lakes. As a brutal storm ripped across the lake, wind gusts reached hurricane force and waves rose over 30 feet. Nearby ships radioed that the Fitzgerald was taking whitewater over the deck, and her radar was down, vents smashed, and one of her lifeboats already torn apart by the waves. At 7:10 p.m., Captain Ernest McSorley made his final transmission, "We are holding our own." Minutes later, the 729-foot ship dropped off radar completely. When search teams managed to locate the wreck 2 days later, the bow was found buried more than 20 feet into the lake bed, showing how quick the ship plummeted through the water. The crew quarters were crushed flat, showing how violently the ship hit the bottom. So fast, the men never even reached their emergency stations. Divers later found crew hard hats still sitting neatly in their storage racks. All 29 crew members were lost, as not a single body was ever recovered. While the exact cause of the sinking still remains a mystery, many experts believe the Fitzgerald was struck by a rare Three Sisters, a set of massive rogue waves that can swallow a vessel in seconds, snapping the large ship in two and sending all 29 men to their graves 530 feet below the surface. In 1995, divers retrieved the ship's bell, the only piece ever brought to the surface, and replaced it with a memorial bell engraved with all 29 names. Every November 10th, it's rung 29 times, one toll for each life lost. In 2010, 77-year-old rancher and hunting expert Don Alejo lived alone on a piece of land near Ciudad Victoria, Mexico, when a local cartel began demanding that he hand over his ranch, a common tactic in the region. They suddenly gave him 24 hours to vacate the property or be killed. Alejo told them he'd think about it, but instead, when the cartel left, he prepared for war. That night, he stayed up fortifying his home. He barricaded doors, moved furniture into firing positions, and set up multiple loaded rifles and shotguns at windows facing all approaches. At dawn, several cartel trucks rolled in expecting an easy takeover, but instead, the gunmen walked straight into a one-man ambush. From inside the house, Don Alejo opened fire with military-level precision. The firefight lasted nearly an hour, and by the time authorities arrived, they found 4 cartel members dead and at least 2 more critically wounded. The house was torn apart by gunfire, and Don Alejo was found inside, killed by return fire, still clutching his shotgun. Mexican Marines who processed the scene later said it was obvious he knew he wouldn't survive. He had prepared it as a final stand. Don Alejo's ranch was never taken by the cartel, and he became a national symbol of defiance in a region where most people are too terrified to fight back. Victoria Wright was born with cherubism, a rare genetic disorder that causes the bones in the lower face to grow erratically, giving her a swollen, distorted appearance that drew cruel comments from strangers her entire life. The condition can be extremely painful by tightening the jaw, straining the facial nerves, and making basic things like chewing or even speaking very difficult at times. As a child, she endured constant looks, bullying, and even adults snickering about her in public as if she wasn't standing right there. But instead of hiding, she turned her diagnosis into a mission, calling out the cruelty she faced after a BBC documentary sparked a wave of online abuse, and becoming a fierce advocate for people with facial differences. In 2015, Mary Cerruti vanished from her Houston bungalow without a trace. 2 years later, the new owners found her skeletal remains sealed inside a wall along with her glasses and shoes. Investigators believe she fell through the attic floor and became trapped, slowly dying alone in total darkness with no way of climbing out. But because she was one of the last homeowners refusing to sell as developers closed in around her, many people still suspect something darker. Her official cause of death remains undetermined. Kim Kardashian's 2018 Met Gala photo, taken in front of the gilded coffin of Nedja Monk, caught the attention of the Manhattan DA's Antiquities Trafficking Unit. When investigators looked into the artifact's paperwork, they discovered the export documents were forged and the coffin had actually been looted from Egypt in 2011. The viral photo helped trigger the investigation that ultimately exposed the trafficking network and led to the coffin being returned to Egypt in 2019. When Yoshitaro Shibasaki and his team scaled Mount Tsurugi in 1907, believed at the time to be Japan's final unclimbed peak. They were stunned to find ancient relics already waiting at the summit. A decorative metal staff fitting and a sword were discovered near the top, and later analysis revealed they'd been placed there over 1,000 years earlier. This 250-year-old mechanical swan still glides and bends its neck as if it were still alive. Built in 1773 by master showman James Cox and ingenious inventor John Joseph Merlin, the automaton uses hundreds of hidden clockwork components to make the bird preen, ripple the water below it, and even snatch a silver fish from the stream. In 1835, a man digging a duck pond in Margate, England, accidentally discovered the Shell Grotto, an underground chalk passage decorated with about 4.6 million seashells arranged across 2,000 square feet of mosaic. Most of the shells, mussels, oysters, scallops, etc., appear to have been collected from nearby Kent beaches, though some are foreign species. Its age, purpose, and creators remain completely unknown. To unlock the secrets of a genius, the man who performed Einstein's autopsy stole his brain and kept it in a jar for 20 years. He found that the part of Einstein's brain that processes math and language was 15% bigger than the average human's. Throughout history, a total of 9 nuclear submarines have been lost around the world. Most of them are still on the ocean floor with nuclear weapons that are still intact. When the Soviet Union was pushing toward Berlin during World War II, a Nazi SS soldier was forced to play piano for his captors. They made it clear to him in sign language that he would be executed the moment he stopped playing. He played for 22 straight hours, after which he collapsed in tears. They congratulated him, then shot him. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his arms and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. Michael had also undergone at least 10 nose jobs, leaving him with a left nostril that was almost completely collapsed. In 1963, the Bronx Zoo had an exhibit called The Most Dangerous Animal in the World. The entire exhibit was just a mirror. Serial killer Richard Chase once attempted to enter a woman's home but walked away after realizing her doors were locked. Chase later told detectives that he took locked doors as a sign that he wasn't welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside. Born in 1661, Charles II of Spain was the result of 200 years of inbreeding that intended to strengthen the family line. He was breastfed until the age of 4 and never fully learned how to walk. As an adult, he was completely illiterate and could barely chew or speak due to his deformed jaw. He was so ugly and disfigured that his own wife was terrified of him. In 2010, a Canadian man rescued a newborn baby from a dumpster only to find out that he was the father. In isolation wards where patients die alone, nurses fill gloves with warm water to simulate the touch of their loved ones. They call it the hand of God. In 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 experienced a window failure in the cockpit, causing the captain to be sucked out. But the crew held on to him for 20 minutes and he miraculously survived despite some frostbite and a few fractures. An 18-year-old girl from Alaska was encouraged to murder her best friend by a boy she met online who claimed to be a multimillionaire. She then convinced 4 others to help her so that they could split a $9 million prize. It ended up being a total scam perpetrated by a mentally disabled man from Indiana. The assassin bug wears the corpses of its prey like a backpack. After stabbing its prey and slurping out the innards, the insect uses the corpses as armor and camouflage. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was released. This is the last known photo of Freddie Mercury before his death in 1991. In order to avoid the attention, Freddie denied rumors about having AIDS until the day before he died. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced from the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would often have their left testicle removed in a painful surgery. In the 1960s, Canadian woodsman Francis Wharton shot a deer and made dentures out of its teeth. He then proceeded to eat the deer with the deer's own teeth. A cat named Oscar correctly predicted the deaths of over 50 patients at a nursing home in Rhode Island. Soon Soon after he arrived at the home, staff noticed that Oscar chose to nap next to patients who would die a few hours later. Nurses would sometimes even place Oscar next to patients they thought would die, but he would move to other patients and be correct every time. Baby Molly Gibson was born in October of 2020, but she was technically 27 years old at her birth, just 2 years younger than her mom. Her embryo was donated in 1992 and stored in a liquid nitrogen tank until she was adopted in 2020 for in vitro fertilization. In 1994, a Russian pilot allowed his 16-year-old son to sit at the controls of the plane, but his son accidentally disabled the autopilot, crashing the plane and killing all 75 passengers on board. From the time of its discovery to its demotion, Pluto didn't even make one full revolution around the sun. If you hit someone with your car in China, you must pay for their medical care for the rest of their life. But if you kill someone with your car, you only have to pay a one-time fee. For this reason, it's common for people to go back and kill someone they accidentally hit. Shortly after going missing for 6 days, Edgar Allan Poe died a mysterious death. When he was found, he was wearing another man's cheap clothing and couldn't explain where he'd been. Acting delirious and distressed, he was brought to the hospital where he died of unknown causes at the age of 40. Bella and Edward's relationship throughout the Twilight series meets all 15 official criteria for an abusive relationship. Up until the 1800s, Turkish women who were accused of cheating on their husbands were tied up in a sack filled with cats, then thrown in the ocean. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up damaging only one office room, and he was the only person that died. In 1997, Bill Cosby's son Ennis was killed in a failed robbery attempt while he was changing a tire. Cosby was working toward his doctorate in special education and planned on building a school for children with disabilities. In 1971, a thief broke into a home and was shot in the legs by a trap set by the homeowner. The thief then sued the homeowner for damages and won. In 1999, a 26-year-old Polish man murdered his father with a screwdriver before making a mask out of his face. He then put on the mask along with his father's clothes and had his grandfather over for breakfast. Due to his poor hearing and eyesight, the old man swore he was talking to his son the entire time. The crime was only discovered when the grandfather found his son's body and called police. The killer was deemed clinically insane after claiming that the murder was an artistic work. In 1912, President Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest just before giving a speech. Upon noticing the bullet missed his lungs, he carried on despite the blood seeping from his shirt. He delivered the full 90-minute speech before accepting medical attention. The first bomb dropped by the Allies during World War II killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo. Alfonso Flores from Texas received a major cosmetic surgery to increase his height from 5'11" to 6'1". He claimed it allowed him to finally achieve his dream of becoming tall. In 2009, Larry Maria Moncada from Iowa disappeared after working his shift at the supermarket. He was missing for more than a decade until his body was found when the supermarket was renovated. The man had fallen into a small gap between the wall and cooler, likely dying from dehydration after a few days of being stuck. North Korean founder Kim Il-sung had a baseball-sized tumor on the back of his head that propaganda officials worked hard to hide. As a result, this is one of the only photos ever taken of the tumor. This disturbing drawing was created by a nonverbal dementia patient in a nursing home. A hitchhiking robot that relied on the kindness of strangers to travel the world made it safely across Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. But just 2 weeks into its American tour, Hitchbot was found in Philadelphia with its arms and head ripped off. If you were to swim near a pod of narwhals and happen to hear one whistle, it might be the last thing that you ever hear. The sounds that narwhals make are so loud that they're said to be deafening to humans. In 2006, a 38-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 years was found dead in her London home with the TV still running. Cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 63 global vertebrate species. They're often considered to be one of the most environmentally damaging invasive predators on the planet. In 2018, a woman who received a lung transplant went into anaphylactic shock after eating peanuts even though she'd never been allergic before. She later discovered that the boy who gave her the lungs had a peanut allergy and actually died from anaphylactic shock himself. Brooke Greenberg was an American woman with an unknown condition called Syndrome X that prevented her from aging. She was 20 years old at the time of her death, but never developed physically or mentally past the age of 1. To make a sword from the blood of your enemies, you would have to kill over 300 people to get enough iron. The U.S. military sends many of its doctors to Chicago to give them practice on gunshot wounds. During World War II, the Soviets tried to train dogs to run under enemy tanks with bombs strapped to their backs. However, this plan fortunately ended up backfiring for the Soviets. Because the dogs had been trained using Soviet tanks, many dogs ended up running to them during actual combat, blowing up friendly tanks instead. In 2017, a Utah woman was murdered by her husband while on a murder mystery-themed cruise in Alaska. Many of the passengers thought that the screams coming from their cabin were all just part of the show. Within 3 days of dying, the bacteria in your stomach that digested your food will begin to digest you. Sent to a German mental hospital in 1907, Katerina Drexel made a husband doll out of straw. It's said that she brought the doll everywhere she went, interacting with it as if it were a living person. In 2015, a Scottish farmer reported seeing a car crash on the side of a highway. It took police 3 days to respond, and by the time they did, they found Lamara Bell in critical condition next to her dead partner. She would succumb to her injuries 4 days later due to the negligence. A man named Martin Pistorius once endured a 12-year coma even though he was completely aware of his surroundings. He could see and hear everything, including his mother saying she hoped he would die. But he couldn't show any signs of consciousness and was completely trapped with nothing but his thoughts. In 1965, a machine was patented to deliver a baby using centrifugal force. The machine would spin the woman until the baby came out, and he or she would be caught in a net. In Switzerland, public restrooms are lit with blue lights so that junkies can't find their veins. This is an example of an underground dungeon called an oubliette in Warwick Castle. Prisoners were often dumped in these extremely narrow passages and forgotten about until they starved to death. Many of these dungeons were also placed under privies, meaning the prisoner would be the recipient of all the human waste in the castle. When Mary Ann Bevan was 32 years old, she was a beautiful nurse who was happily married with 4 children. But all of that changed in 1906 when she began suffering from acromegaly, a disease that doctors couldn't quite understand at the time. Mary was experiencing migraines and joint pain that turned into abnormal facial growth and distortion. Within 5 years, she looked like a completely different person and saw her beauty continue to fade with each day. Due to her ugliness, she was eventually fired from her job, and in 1914, her husband Thomas died from a stroke, leaving Anne and the 4 children behind. Desperate to feed her kids, Anne decided to enter a contest and won the offensive title of Ugliest Woman in the World. She was offered a job at Dreamland Circus in Coney Island, where she endured daily ridicule for 13 years until her death in 1933. In 1987, Kenneth Parks drove 12 miles to his mother-in-law's house and stabbed her to death in the middle of the night. But he didn't receive any jail time because Parks' lawyer was able to prove that he was sleepwalking the entire time. The bolt at the top of a helicopter shaft that holds it all together is called the Jesus nut. It got its name because if it fails in flight, the only thing left to do is to pray to Jesus. Viking warriors who were badly wounded were given onion soup to test whether or not they would survive. Someone would smell the wounds after a few minutes, and if onions were detected, it meant that death was imminent. Pedro Lopez is a Colombian serial killer who was sentenced in 1980 after murdering more than 300 young girls. But after serving 18 years in Ecuadorian prison, he was released on good behavior in 1998, and his current whereabouts are unknown.